Okay, so this lesson's we're going to start to focus on ethics in sociological research. Now, this is part of research methods, which is on paper 2. We haven't actually fully started research methods. We've just briefly touched on research methods at different points throughout the course when we've been looking at different studies and pieces of research. But now we're getting to a point in Venkatesh's research on his book Gang Leader for a Day, where we're starting to really see some ethical considerations that we should now start to address. So that's the purpose of us going through ethics at this stage, even though we are still looking at age inequalities in paper 2, section B. We haven't completed that fully just yet. So the purpose of this lesson is to understand the ethical guidelines that regulate sociological research. And there I've put links and developments. Because we're still reading Venkatesh's Gang Leader for a Day, in particular we're moving on to chapter 3, we'll try and link some of these ethics to Venkatesh's research. The reason being is that if you're asked a 20-mark question, an extended essay question that surrounds ethical guidelines and ethical considerations, to get up to level 3 and really cement yourself into level 4, you've got to actually justify and explain and elaborate on the ethical guidelines by using sociological research and evidence, so you can apply your findings and your explanation, your answer to Venkatesh's research. And we'll have a look at a couple of other unethical studies in sociology throughout this lesson as well. So if we just think about ethics, most people have an understanding of what is meant by ethics and whether or not something is ethical. So for instance, you might study philosophy and ethics at A level. We also consider ethics in science with regards to animal testing and research. That's probably where most people have considered ethics. There's some key words that generally are associated with ethics, but a nice way to summarize what is meant by ethics is the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. And that's what we're focusing on, the person's behavior being the sociologist's behavior, and the conducting of the activity would be the sociological research. So is it morally right to do what the research is doing, to collect the data that they're collecting, and to carry out the research that they're carrying out? Now, in sociology, it's the British Sociological Association that sets the guidelines for ethical research in the UK. If you went and conducted research in different countries, they'd have their own ethical guidelines, but generally these guidelines will be consistent no matter which sociological association you conducted research for and on the behalf of. Now, the British Sociological Association, the BSA, is made up of the key academics and experts, sociologists working for various different universities, charities and organisations. So these will be the individuals that heavily influence social and government policy. They'll be the individuals who work for the large charities and organisations who conduct research on a daily basis. And they will be the individuals who sit down together and decide what are the guidelines and the regulations that we can set for all sociologists, whether or not they are conducting their own research or whether even they're just involved in sociological in the discipline of sociology. So for instance, a teacher at university, a lecturer, even though they might not conduct research themselves, they are still bound and regulated by these guidelines that are set by the BSA. The most recent publication, I believe, was 2017. If you go onto the website, you can actually download the publications. Now, the ethical guidelines are massive. The booklets are huge with regards to what a sociologist can and cannot do in response to their research. But it's not just the BSA that sets the ethical guidelines. Each individual university and organisation will have their own ethics committee. So here's a picture of Birmingham University, and we also have an example of an ethics committee. These will be the academics and the individuals who consider what is morally right in the eyes of the university. So even though you might pass the guidelines that is set by the BSA, when you're conducting research on the behalf of the university, they might actually say, no, we don't think that this is morally right, or we don't think that this is research that the university wants to be associated with. So even though you might pass one ethical guideline, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will pass another. And the same applies. You might pass an ethics committee from a university or an organization, but then the BSA might say, actually, no, we don't think it is morally right what you intend to do or how you intend to treat your participants. Now, it's really important that we understand that these ethics committees are before the research has been conducted. So you would make your proposal, this is what I intend to do, and the ethics committee will then give you advice and feedback on whether or not you can do it, whether or not you need to amend your research and how you collect data, how you treat participants, or they might ultimately say, no, that is not in the best intentions, or that's not something that we can agree is morally acceptable. So it's always before the research has been conducted. But the key word is these are ethical guidelines and not ethical rules. So there are guidelines that are open to interpretation and debate, which we'll discuss as we go through this lesson. And then when we look back at studies like Venkatesh's Gang Leader for a Day, we might say that there are ethical considerations or ethical issues with the study. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have broken ethics. It just means that some individuals, some committees, some members of a sociological association might say, actually, I don't think that that's morally right. I don't think that that should have taken place. So these are the key ethical guidelines that we're focusing on for this lesson. Informed consent, confidentiality, protection and safety, and the integrity of the subject and the discipline. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the actual guidelines for various different university ethic committees and the guidelines that are set by the BSA are the massive. They're broken down into various different points for each one of these key ethical guidelines. But for the purpose of the A-levels, most ethical guidelines relate to these 4 key principles. So we'll just focus on the 4 key principles, and we'll expand a little bit more and talk about developing our explanation, our understanding of each one of these ethical guidelines and how it might be broken or how it might be met by a researcher when they're conducting their studies. So let's start off with informed consent. So consent is a word that we know means agreement, whether or not you consent and you agree to something. So informed consent, we could just give it as a brief definition that participants must voluntarily provide information and answers for the purpose of research. So all participants must be made aware that they are being interviewed, they are being observed, or they're completing a questionnaire completely voluntarily. They're not being forced to carry out this, to take part in the research, to participate. And ultimately, they must be aware that their answers that they give are to benefit the research. They're going to be included in a study. So sociologists can't just pretend to be a general person having a chat, record down everything that a person says, and then include it in their data, because that would not be an example of informed consent. So here's the more detailed response from the ethical practice, the statement of ethical practice that's published by the British Sociological Association in 2017. You don't need to know anything that's recorded in blue. It's just to elaborate on the points that we're making with these key ethical guidelines. So the BSA say, as far as possible, participation in sociological research should be based on the freely given informed consent of those studied. This implies a responsibility on the sociologist to explain in appropriate detail and in terms meaningful to the participants what the research is about, who is undertaking and financing it, and why it's being undertaken, and how it is going to be distributed and used. Now, this is a key part of informed consent. You can't just ask a participant, please will you take part in my study? It's a little more detailed than that. So if we just have a look at what the BSA statement is referring to, it's got to be explained in appropriate detail. So the aim and the purpose of the study has to be elaborated on. It can't just be, I'm interested in this. So with regards to Venkatesh, we know that his original aim of the study was to understand what it's like to be black and poor. However, we could use this interpretation now and look back and say, actually, he could have possibly gone into a little more detail with the purpose and the aims of his research. It also says in terms that are meaningful to the participants. We've got to accept that most sociologists will be conducting research for the purpose of social policy. For organisations, they might be using terminology that a normal participant, an everyday person, somebody who doesn't study or conduct sociological research might not be familiar with, such as quantitative, qualitative. Do they understand what that means? So a sociologist has to make sure that when they're getting or collecting informed consent from the participants, that they are effectively translating and they're making it really clear, so that the participants fully understand what they're consenting to and try and avoid any unnecessary specific terminology that might be unfamiliar to the participants. They've also got to make it clear who's potentially financing the research. Is it a university? Is it independent? Or is it an organisation? And ultimately, how it's going to be distributed and used. So what is the purpose of conducting the research? Now, there are significant issues with consent and getting informed consent. Now, one of the biggest issues is something that we've previously talked about when looking at Venkatesh's gang leader for a day. If you have informed consent from the participant, could that reduce the validity of the findings? And ultimately, we refer to something called the Hawthorne effect, where a participant might change their behaviour because they're being observed. And the same applies with informed consent. It's often also referred to things like demand characteristics, is a term that you might see in some of the revision guides, or social desirability. If a participant is aware that they are taking part in research and they are aware of the purpose of the research, which is a key characteristic of informed consent, are they naturally going to give us, are they going to behave naturally, or are they going to give us answers that are natural and what they truly mean? Or potentially could they be influenced by the fact that they know the purpose of the research and they know that they are being studied, or everything they say is being recorded? This is also a significant issue with conducting covert research, because covert research means that you're undercover, like a covert operation. And if you are going to conduct covert research, informed consent cannot be given. So the participants, if they are unaware that they're being studied and part of a study, then they obviously can't give informed consent. Now, many sociologists will use covert research to get around that first issue, to ensure that the behaviour they are observing or the answers that are being provided by the participants are not being affected by the fact that they are aware they're being studied. Now, covert research does take place. Like we say, these guidelines, not rules, so a sociologist can conduct covert research. However, it's highly recommended that following the study, a sociologist should make it clear how and why the data is being used or collected to the participants after the research has taken place. And again, at that opportunity, the participant could say, I don't agree for you to include me in your study. They still have the right to withdraw and say, I do not give you informed consent, even though the data might have already been collected. The next one, parental consent is needed for those under the age of 18. So for instance, in our school setting, even though you might be 17 or 18, if we want to take you on a school trip, we have to have parental consent. You have to sign the letter, which obviously is very frustrating when you might feel I'm old enough to make these decisions myself. And the same applies to sociological research. A sociologist, if they want to study youth subcultures, for instance, and what it's like to be, moving into year 12, a 16, 17-year-old studying A-levels for the first time, they'd still need parental consent. Now, that might not be such an issue, gaining parental consent, but then it might start to limit the fields of possible research. So, for instance, there's a significant lack of research to understand how children might experience homelessness, or the number of children living on the streets. And this could be one of the stumbling blocks, that you can actually physically find a young person on the street, but how do you get consent from parents or guardians if we can't have contact with parents and guardians? Fieldwork that takes a long time. This is another significant issue with informed consent. Often participants forget that they're taking part in research. Now, we've talked about sociologists potentially building relationships and the benefits of a sociologist building relationships with their participants to potentially increase the validity of their answers and make them feel a little more comfortable. However, we also have to take into consideration that they might provide informed consent at the start of research, but as the research goes along and a relationship develops, the participants then forget that they are taking part in a research. So there is an argument of any fieldwork that takes a long time, the sociologist should continuously remind the participants that they are consenting and they are participating in research. Now, if we think about Venkatesh as gang leader for a day, we know that he spent months, if not years, visiting the Robert Taylor housing project, observing the gang and talking to the gang members. He had their original consent because we know in the stairwell he admitted that he was a sociologist conducting research. However, how frequently does he remind these individuals that everything they say is contributing to his research? And we know that when he accidentally lets slip in chapter 2 that he has to record down what has been said or what he's observed during one of the surveys of the stairwell, he describes it as his heart freezing when he realizes what he said in front of JT. So even there, Venkatesh kind of describes himself as maybe forgetting or maybe not realizing that everything that is being recorded, or maybe the participants aren't fully aware that they have give consent for Venkatesh to record down their behavior and record down anything that is said to him as part of the research. So here, again, referring back to the statement of ethical practice, it should also be borne in mind that in some research contexts, especially those involving field research, it may be necessary for the obtaining of consent to be regarded not as a once and for all prior event, but as a process subject to renegotiation over time. So the BSc are advising sociologists, especially if it's a long piece of research, that they might have to renegotiate with participants. So participants might say, well, I originally agreed to include myself in the study. However, I don't agree for this to be included, or I don't want that part to be included. I don't want you to record down what I say now or what you observe now. And it shouldn't be something that's just a document that's signed off at the start of the research and then forgotten about until the end of the study. So now we've got an idea of informed consent. Can you identify any potential issues relating to the consent within Sudhir Venkatesh's study? We've already talked about one, so we've considered the fact length of time, but are there any other issues potentially with Sudhir gaining informed consent from the participants in his study? So anybody that he interviews, anybody that he observes that maybe haven't been considered by Sudhir and potentially could be seen as unethical. If you want to, you can pause this video and complete that activity. There's also a few notes in the PowerPoint, so if you upload the PowerPoint or open up the PowerPoint and have a look at the notes section, I've given you some ideas and clues on how to attempt that activity. However, we'll move on. The second key ethical guideline, confidentiality. Participants' personal identities should remain a secret and private following the publication of research. So again, we'll refer back to the statement. Research participants should understand how far they will be afforded anonymity and confidentiality and should be able to reject the use of data gathering devices such as tape recorders and video cameras. So it should be made clear to the participants that everything is being recorded, everything that they say, and the sociologist should try and ensure that no private details of that participant are published. So if somebody is wearing, if a researcher that is wearing a wire, so to speak, or a small camera to record down and to help them collect information and data, they should not include that and publish that when they publish their findings. There should be nothing that could lead to the identification of anyone who participates in their study. This includes things like photographs and obviously names. So in Venkatesh's research, JT, even though it refers to, I think Jerome Thomas he calls him, is not his real name. For ethical reasons, so they could not include any of these individuals' real names in for the purpose of research. Even if the participants agrees, even if the participant says, yeah, I'm happy for you to include my real name, it would most likely break ethical guidelines, and an ethics committee would say, no, you can't do that. You've just got to change the name to maybe a pseudonym or participant 1, participant 2. So there are significant issues with confidentiality. The police and courts can force a sociologist to reveal their contact and information in some cases. Sorry, we'll just go back to that point. So whenever the sociologist is collecting this information, they also have to make it clear to participants that that is a real situation that can occur. So in some fields of research, such as anybody studying something like drug use or criminal networks, like being gang leader for a day, the police could force the sociologist to reveal their contacts. So therefore, again, with regards to confidentiality, that could be a potential issue that restricts research. The second one, methods of collecting and recording data may compromise confidentiality. So like we said there, if somebody's wearing a wire or a video camera, even though we might only hear their voice, that could compromise their confidentiality. Somebody might recognize who said that from the voice. Now, this is becoming an increasing problem with regards to research in the fields of digital communication, such as people who write blogs, who use chat rooms, who play games online, etc. And paper 3, we focus on research into digital communication and how people are using social media and networking, because obviously once it's online, it potentially is being stored potentially forever. Another issue, can other participants see the information from the study and work out who said what? It is an issue. Many sociologists or many participants who are taking part in research will ask a sociologist if they can look at what is being written about themselves or what has been recorded down so far. Now, that's entirely up to the sociologist whether they want that to happen or whether or not they're comfortable and happy for that to take place. However, could a participant see what other participants have said in an interview or as part of an observation and work out who said what, and could that then have other potential implications, such as somebody saying something that another participant isn't happy about, and could that result in potential risks to safety of some of the participants? Can some of the information published inadvertently reveal the identity of participants? So we've got to be really careful as a sociologist that if you're publishing key information about some of your participants, somebody who reads that information once it's been published might unintentionally work out who you're talking about. Now, this generally happens with researchers who are interviewing or conducting research with murderers and serial killers, because certain information is often included in a study, such as the location or the description and details of a murder scene, that could make it quite easy to identify who is being interviewed, even though a sociologist might change names to pseudonames, fake names, and try the best to maintain confidentiality. It might then ultimately result in people being able to work out who has said that information, who is participating in the research. Now, if we just think about Venkatesh as research together, we know quite a lot about JT, and I've said that that's a pseudonym. It's not really his name. However, if the other information that we know about JT and that Venkatesh shares about JT is correct, could it lead to his recognition? So, for instance, we know that JT completed college. We know that he initially had an athletic scholarship, which there's not that many students who are given athletic scholarships. He's completed college. We also know that he worked as a salesman, so he sold stationery and textiles. We know that his mother lives in the Robert Taylor buildings. We know that he drives a Malibu. And we also know that he lives in building 4040. So there's quite a lot of information that we've been provided with in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 about JT. And it would make it significantly easy for somebody who potentially knows JT or somebody who lives in Chicago to be able to identify and work out the real identity of JT. Now, in Venkatesh's defense, he was conducting his research in the late 80s and he didn't actually publish his study until 2009. So he waited a significant amount of time before he actually published his study. So it's highly unlikely now that we would be able to identify JT from these characteristics that have been shared. However, it is something that a sociologist must take into consideration. The third one, protection and safety. A sociologist has to avoid harm and do good. This is not just for the participants, for themselves and community or group they are studying. So again, we'll refer back to the BSA. Social researchers face a range of potential risks to their safety. Safety issues need to be considered in the design and conduct of social research projects, and procedures should be adopted to reduce the risk to researchers, including, importantly, any research assistants employed. And this is one of the reasons why Professor Wilson in Venkatesh's Gang Leader for a Day did not want Sudhir to walk around these neighborhoods or even walk into Washington Park with a clipboard and a survey and start asking people. He wanted him to use a comparative method and to use or stick with using official statistics, because Professor Wilson also has to concern himself with the safety of his research team, his research assistants. However, we know that Sudhir takes it on his own consideration to go into these areas, and we know how potentially dangerous that was. The fact that originally gang members thought that he was from another gang or potentially an undercover police officer, which could have quite easily resulted in significant harm or even his death by him deciding to do that. So sociologists have to take that into consideration. Again, some risks might be seen by ethics committees as worth taking. They might say, actually, yeah, it is worthwhile you taking these risks to collect the data or to study to study the behaviour and the individuals that you want to study. However, it should be a key priority that a sociologist should be protecting themselves, other people conducting research, and obviously protecting the participants. And let's just focus on about that protection for the sociologists and participants. When we think about protection, we generally think of physical harm. However, we can't just accept that when we're considering protection and safety, to protect somebody from physical harm is good enough. We also have to take into consideration protecting people from psychological harm. So that could be such as unnecessary embarrassment, distress, or anxiety that might be caused by the research. It could be what is often referred to as secondary victimization. So if we're asking participants to think about past traumatic experience that they have had, could that then increase psychological harm? Could they experience secondary victimization like flashbacks, which was unnecessary and effectively has been caused by the sociologist asking them to think back? So these are the kind of things that we have to take into consideration. We also have to think about protection and safety in regards to breaking the law. Now, if the sociologist is involved in participant observation, which results in them breaking the law, they cannot say to a police officer or a court, well, I was a sociologist, so I wasn't actually intending to do that behaviour, I was just a sociologist conducting research. You've broken the law, so you could still face legal consequences. You could still be sent to prison and be arrested for your involvement in the behaviour. It's not a good defence to say, well, I'm a sociologist and I was just interested in the behaviour. But also we have to take into consideration the ethical guidelines around a sociologist observing the law being broken. Does a sociologist have a responsibility to inform the police if they see a crime taking place, if their participants are involved in a crime? Now, again, that's quite subjective. If it's a sociologist watching a group of teenagers maybe smoke cannabis and smash up a bus shelter, then you might argue, well, actually, no, because the repercussions of the sociologist not informing the police are quite low and minimal. However, what if a sociologist observes a gang beating up another person, beating up a member of the public? What if a sociologist knows that a group of individuals are intending to hurt somebody else? So if they intend to murder somebody else or attack a rival gang, does then the sociologist have an obligation to inform the police and say, I know from me conducting research that this is likely to happen or this event is going to take place? I mentioned secondary victimization as well there, protection from psychological harm. It's not just psychological harm, obviously. If somebody's experienced secondary victimization, it might not just affect them, it might affect their wider family, and it could also then result in physical harm if they then start to carry out behaviors as a coping mechanism of the secondary victimization. Again, just to give you an example, like drinking, excessively drinking to drown the sorrows, could that effectively been avoided by the sociologist not including them in research or not asking certain questions in an interview? And sticking with protection and safety, last points. Not only should a sociologist protect their participants, but they should try to improve the well-being of those being studied. Now, this is a bit of a controversial comment, and this is where you can start to draw the line between a positivist and an interpretivist or a social action theorist, and how they start to differ in their approach to research. Because a positivist places a lot of emphasis on remaining objective and detached from the participants and the individuals that are being studied, where an interpretivist like Venkatesh says, actually, you want to subject yourselves to the behaviour of the participants and fully involve yourself in their lives to really understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And this is the same that applies to research. Many sociologists would argue that a sociologist shouldn't be completely objective. Their purpose is not just to study somebody's behaviour, but to try and improve the lives of the people who are being studied. And we know that sociologists focus a lot of their intentions to minority groups and those who suffer from inequalities. Now, feminist is probably the best perspective to use to demonstrate what we mean about trying to ensure that participants' lives are effectively improved. So here we have a quote from a feminist called DeVault in 1996, referring to feminist research. This is especially important to some sociologists. For example, feminists believe that researchers should not only focus on minimizing the harm to those being researched, but also improve their lives. And just to give you an example, Anne Oakley, who we've studied quite a lot for paper 1 and paper 2, who looks at gender role socialization, when she was conducting research using pregnant mothers and interviewing pregnant mothers about their pregnancy and about their role within the family and the role as a housewife, she actively helped and participated in housework. So not only did she just remain objective and interview these women, she would help with the housework, and she would even share her subjective experience of pregnancy and being a housewife herself, or her experience of people being housewives, I should say. And this even resulted in Anne Oakley being invited to some of the births of the mothers that she were interviewing. So she really, really got herself involved with the research. And Anne Oakley looks back and she reflects, and when she's carried out follow-up research with those women who were originally part of her sample, many of the women reported Anne Oakley's presence actually helped resolve some of their concerns and relieve some of their anxieties that they had about the future and about motherhood. So effectively, they're saying that Anne Oakley has improved their life through her conducting research. And then the final point, the integrity of the subject and the field. A sociologist should not conduct research or use any methods that could be damaging to the field of sociology, other academics, or other research. During their research, again, this is from the Statement of Ethical Practice, during their research, sociologists should avoid, where they can, actions which may have a deleterious, so just negative consequence for sociologists who come after them, or which might undermine the reputation of sociology as a discipline. If we have a lot of rogue sociologists conducting research that's considered to be unethical, that could have serious implications for future research. So organizations and companies might not want to fund research. They might not want to provide the finances for other sociologists to conduct research because they might be fearful that they might be also tarred with a negative brush or seen in a negative light, receive a negative label. It might be that other sociologists struggle to get participants to provide informed consent because of previous unethical research. And it ultimately might be that we have a number of students or prospective students who do not decide to study sociology. And if we don't have A-level students, if we don't have university students, then the future of sociology would significantly be affected because we don't have the future potential sociologists. So it's really important that we consider the integrity of the subject field and make sure that sociologists aren't just focusing on their own personal intentions, their own personal reputation, that they accept that they are representing other sociologists and the field of research itself. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to download this additional sheet from Class Charts. I want you to look at the unethical studies. There's 4 unethical studies and explain why they are considered unethical. What I want you to do is I want you to write your answers not on the sheet. If you're editing this as a Word document, then you can type your answers underneath each paragraph. If you're printing this off, write it on line paper, separate line paper, and make sure that you're writing in full sentences. In your answer, I want you to really highlight the key ethical guidelines that are broken. I mean, physically highlight it. So, for instance, if the sociologist doesn't have informed consent from the participants. And in each study, there could be more than one ethical guideline that's broken. And I fully want you to explain it, and I want you to reference back to the research. So you can pause this video to do that if you would like. The final part I would like you to do in preparation for next week is to start to read chapter 3. Now, chapter 3 is a very large chapter, so we're not going to read chapter 3 all in one go. What I would like you to do is I'd like you to read up to around page 93. Now, I say around page 93 because if you're using the PDF file or if you've got a physical copy of the book, it might be a few pages higher, so it could be up to maybe a page 100, or it could be lower depending on the font size. Ultimately, you'll know when to stop because the incident, what I want you to really focus on, is where Boo Boo, who's a member of the Robert Taylor Housing Project, she attacks a local shop. So she attacks a local shop because she claims that one of the men who run the shop has raped her daughter. The entire community then start to attack the shop, and we start to see how the gang are involved in the attack on the shop. What I want you to do then is I want you to write a paragraph that explains the ethical issues surrounding the study and the involvement of Sudhir. And I really want you to focus your paragraph on the information in chapter 3. Now, as a part of the stretching challenge, you can then start to refer to other ethical concerns that might have been raised in chapter 1 and chapter 2, such as the attack and the beating of C-Note. It could be, watching drug users or the attack on drug users. There's quite a lot of violence that's starting to come about now in this book, so you can link it to other ethical considerations from previous chapters. But I want you to focus on chapter 3, ready for the end of next week. So read it first, then start to link and use the information from this PowerPoint to write that paragraph.